Remember, guys, we're trying this new format, and I'd love your feedback on it. We've had so many incredible guests. I mean, just the most amazing people with so much to say. And we have this limited amount of time. So I thought what I'd like to do is have Tom curate some of the highlights of some of those interviews, and then just dig deeper into them, dive deeper through an IM lens. And tonight, we're going to be talking about addiction and substance use. And we've got a couple of clips that I'd like Tom to play. We'll start with whichever one you want, Tom. And let's just start thinking about the deeper meaning of what our amazing guests have been saying. So Tom, what do we want to start with tonight?
Well, why don't we start with a repeat guest, fan favorite, Shana of Drug Story Theater.
Terrific. Let's hear what we got.
And Ben, if you could unmute yourself.
My counselor at school mentioned that I might have a problem. And I was like, no, not me. I don't have a problem. I can give it up.
Counselor from what grade?
I was in high school. I was probably ninth grade at that point.
And your counselor knew you were using spice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But, and so I had given up spice, but what I did was I put down one substance and I picked up alcohol. And once I started to have a problem with alcohol, I realized that it wasn't like the substances, it was me that had the problem, because once I picked up alcohol, I did the same exact thing that I did with spice, where I started drinking every day, every morning,
What were you drinking?
Whiskey.
Whiskey?
Yeah.
Wow, okay. Yeah. Before school?
Mm-hmm.
And
during, sometimes after.
Counselors and teachers weren't kind of like, you're behaving kind of strange today. Can we talk about that for a second?
A lot of times I didn't go to school knowing that they'd know.
Just cut?
Yeah, I just wouldn't go.
And would they call home and say, wasn't in school today?
Shana.
Where is Shana? Where is Shana today?
Shana?
Does anybody know where Shana is today?
They kind of gave up calling my mom after a while, but in the play I also mentioned it. I went to an alternative high school, and which was really a good fit for me because I had a lot of anxiety issues, so it was a smaller school. But my home school they paid for my placement there, and they threatened to take away my placement. So because I missed like 6 days out of, or 4 days, a lot of days of school of the week. And that's when I started to get help, because I was like, oh, maybe I'll just push them off a bit and like be like, see, I'm getting help, like don't kick me out of school, because I realized I needed to be there in order to graduate. So but then I kind of got into getting sober once I went into treatment.
It's strange how institutions will play hot potato with kids struggling with addiction. It seems like they stop. I can't speak to Shana's school system, but it sounded like they were kind of passing the buck. Like, I can't deal with this. I'm not equipped to deal with this, so I'll pass it over to you. And then she stopped calling.
Well, she certainly felt like they gave up on her, right? I mean, in her own words, they gave up calling my mom. And I don't know if that was because mom wasn't paying attention or they gave up.
Well,
what's that going to
do? Go on, Tom. What were you going to say?
I mean, what's that going to do to your self-esteem?
Right.
Yeah. And that really is part of the whole abandonment of folks with addiction and with mental health issues and with so many things, that somehow we will turn our back on them and say it's okay. I mean, that's the part that really is quite astonishing, is how we can justify turning our backs on people, because we have, and we were talking about this last week as well, we sort of lump them into a group that is disordered or is not part of our group or is somehow a person that we so mistrust, we don't want them anywhere near us. And so we pass them on to someone else. And yeah, from an IC point of view, I mean, how does that make you feel? And how does that then contribute perhaps or perpetuate the very desire to use drugs or alcohol? I mean, if the brain is going to choose between something, it really wants pleasure. There's nothing wrong with feeling pleasure. It's the kind of pleasure that you get, which is the problem from a brain point of view. So I'm so glad that you picked Shana to start this discussion off, because Shana, remarkable young woman who absolutely was determined to turn her life around, had enormous anxiety, had a struggle with depression, used drugs and alcohol as a way to avoid some of these feelings, and began to realize that every time she used a drug to avoid a feeling, she began convincing herself she wasn't strong enough to deal with those feelings. And so she would use again, and began creating the very feelings she was afraid that she couldn't manage. And what I'm especially proud of with Shana is that here a young woman who had so much anxiety was able to get up in front of, in essence, 30,000 people over time and share her story. And that is empowering, because the people in the audience reminded her every time that they were listening, and every time they applauded, they reminded her of her value. And that over time felt better than drugs and alcohol. And this young woman is now married, she's working, she's got a couple of kids, and she's been sober for years. So what's the lesson here? I think the lesson is, once you begin to really understand why someone is doing what they're doing, and you begin to wonder with them instead of worrying, you can reflect on what's going on in the 4 domains and why the best they could do was use drugs. Now, spice, just for people who know, we're not talking about cinnamon or nutmeg or something. We're talking about a chemical that was sprinkled on basically incense, organic incense, a plant, but it got you so high, it was almost like tripping. And the people would become very aggressive as well. It wasn't like just, it wasn't smoking weed. This was a whole different thing. And it was legal and sprinkled on these things that you bought as incense in gas stations, and anyone could buy it. And then people began to realize how dangerous this drug really was. And so the FDA banned it. But when you ban a drug, you're actually banning a chemical structure. And so what the people who were creating spice did is they would literally change one molecule, like maybe a carbon or a chloride or a sodium. And now it's a different chemical. And so the FDA had to ban that. And I'm not exactly sure how they did it, but they've been able to get it off the shelves completely, which is a very good thing. But that spice, we saw a whole wave of it at Castle when I had my adolescent substance abuse program. And these kids were like really, really hurting. I mean, it really had a long-term effect on their brain, their cognitive skills. They were sort of dazed most of the time. Some of them, wound up with kidney problems and other problems because it was not just a benign drug. And
would each new chemical scratch the itch left from the last?
Yeah, exactly right. It would scratch the itch. It would like feed that little dopamine-ergic part of your limbic system and say, oh, thank goodness, here it is. And it was incredibly, incredibly addictive as well. And we didn't really have, many, direct drugs or medicines to help with the withdrawal. So it was usually what we call sort of comfort medicines, just to help ease some of the anxiety and some of the sleep problems. But we don't have like the same sort of detox protocol that we do for alcohol or benzodiazepines or opioids. But the real issue here is, why do we turn our backs on people who are in such need and then are astonished that they don't come in for treatment? You guys know the numbers, right? Go ahead, Tom, you were going to say something.
Well, I know that there is the philosophy of, well, it's not tough love, it's just love to turn your back. It's like, I can't reward you with attention watching you destroy yourself. And I guess I can sort of follow a line of logic there, but what do you think is going to happen when you turn your back?
Yeah.
Especially if they're hurting for money, if they're going through the last cents for a hit. There are a few very unsavory job options that people don't last long.
Mm.
If you get my meaning, it's a dangerous thing to abandon someone who's that addicted.
It is. It is. And part of what's happening in the brain is that the person with the addiction is shutting down the IC domain. So think, what does that really mean? If somebody stops caring what other people think or feel about them, they stop caring what other people think or feel. And that then, in a person who has their IC intact, that elicits all sorts of responses. Anxiety and anger and sadness and the idea that somehow you are devaluing me. When what's really happening is because of the dopamine oxytocin interaction. Remember, oxytocin, not OxyContin, oxytocin is basically the brain chemical of trust. So the dopamine is interfering with trust. It's not a surprise that people don't trust a person with an addiction. But I want you to understand the reason. It's not because of the moral issue. Addiction is not about morality, it's about mortality. It's the way the brain works. So when somebody else's brain is stopping and cutting down and inhibiting the ability to care about you, of course, you may want to turn your back. It makes sense. But then you got to step back and say, wait a second, what's happening in the 4 domains? Because I know this person. I know something's going on with them, because if their I am right now is to turn their back on me, that doesn't make sense of who I know they are. That has something to do with the way the dopamine is interfering with the oxytocin in their prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of the brain. And of course, this is what we teach in drug story theater. You know, drug story theater. Shana was a major part of drug story theater. She was one of our first kids. And she was right in there doing the psychodrama and helping us create the very, very first show. And she was amazing.
So for those listeners that don't know what drug story theater is, Dr. Joe, what is drug story theater?
The drug story theater is my nonprofit where we take teenagers in the early stages of recovery. We teach them improvisational theater, and then we use psychodrama, and they create their own scripted shows about the seduction of, addiction to, and recovery from drugs and alcohol. And they have been performing these shows for middle schools and high schools. So the treatment of one becomes a prevention of many. And in between each scene, the kids step out of character and they do PowerPoint presentations teaching the audience about the neuroscience of adolescent brain development and why it's at such risk for addiction. And all the kids in the audience take a pre-show neuroscience quiz. All those questions are answered in the show, and then the kids take the same quiz after the show. And we've been measuring how kids who learn about their brain change their perception about drugs and alcohol. Not trying to scare them, but just trying to tell them that these are things that are going on in the brain. It's not about morality, it's about mortality, just the way your brain is. So drug story theater in the time of COVID, what we have done, and you guys can go to our website, drugstorytheater.org, we have a film of one of our performances, and it is about these 3 young girls and their journey through addiction that they created. And Shana's in it. So you can check it out. Shana, Emily, and Heather. And we are trying to get it in front of every 6th grader in the United States and their parents, especially now during the time of COVID. Because we know that the addiction rates are going up, the first-time substance use is going up, the depression is going up. We got to be able to do this. COVID, unfortunately, is not an immunization against substance use.
Stretch the cat.